Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. با 100,000 جلوه برون آمدی که من با 100,000 دیده تماشا کنم تو را. The words of Shaykh Bastami, who says, with 100,000 manifestations in glory you have come before me, so that I may witness your beauty with 100,000 eyes, expressing impossibility, desirability, imaginability, and a sense of wonder that the one to be worshipped may not be within the realm of our capacity to be worshipped as he deserves to be. As all creation around us is the beauty of God manifested, so that in addition to worshipping, we may glorify him by acknowledging, appreciating, admiring, and most of all, loving his beauty. The manifestations might be ordinary, in which we may or may not see the beauty, and they might be exceptional and outstanding, where there will be no need for words or other means of expressions to know how beautiful something is. Sometimes we could go to look at a flower, and we might be a botanist, we might be a gardener, we might be a geneticist, we might be looking at different things, looking at one flower. And often we overlook that the beauty in the flower is the beauty of the divine reflected within it. But more so, God has given us the vision so that the beauty is not just in the flower and it's not just in our eyes, but in the suspense between the seen and the seeing that creates a dynamic for understanding what God really is through his attributes of beauty. Sifat al-Jamaliya, as we call it in Arabic. In one such an instance, in an early morning, a man stood in a garden studying, observing, and admiring roses. As much as his eyes tried to worship divine beauty's manifestation in the rose, his heart's desire, of course, was that, but his mind was troubled and preoccupied with the unthinkable anticipations. Restlessness, hopelessness, aimlessness, and placelessness bothered him. He left the garden, but not alone. He took a rose with him. Moments later, his face could be seen in the streets of the city that were thronged with people. The city was named the Garden of Justice. I'll give you the Arabic translation of it in reverse later. In these streets there was an air of eventfulness pregnant with expectation, of bad omens on the cusp of a tragedy in the making. A tragedy that would shake the spiritual foundation of a dawning civilization and shake them very, very profoundly. The man stood in the town square where authorities condemned the utterance of truth, because they were going to bring a man who, among other things, was a poet who had uttered words that were not acceptable to the norm of those who think in matter rather than in meaning. He had said, "I am the truth." The man was Hallaj, Hussein ibn Mansur Hallaj. The man who brought the rose was his master, Shibli. The significance of the rose is that a rose is a rose only when its petals are in enfold, containing and keeping the secret. If that secret is revealed, the petals fall apart. There is no more rose. The secret between the master and his disciple Hallaj was that they both knew what he meant when he said, "I am the truth." But the majority of the people didn't. So he was condemned to be executed and mutilated, his body taken apart, set on the gallows, and hanged. What were the words the man had uttered? That the Sufis, when they legendify his death, says that when every drop of his blood fell to the ground, it uttered the word, "I am the truth." But the majority thought this was blasphemous. Those words came from Hallaj's deeper understanding of what the divine is, which goes as follows. Before does not outstrip him. Beyond does not interrupt him. When does not stop him. Behind does not limit him. After, here we go. Technology's own wonders.
Actually, we're not seeing anything.
Yeah, you're not supposed to.
That's the secret.
The secret is the rose. I wanted to quote him directly. That's why I want to read his poem in his words. Sometimes they blend with mine. So without diluting. After does not cause him to pass away. Is does not bring him into being. Is not does not deprive him from being. His pre-existence preceded him time. His being preceded non-being. His eternity preceded limit. If thou sayest before, before is after him. If thou sayest where, his being preceded space. He is hidden in his manifestation, manifest in his concealing. He is outward and inward, near and far. Those were the ideas condemned to be eliminated from the face of earth in the mind of the average person in Baghdad. Why did this happen? Because religiosity, as it was understood at the time, was working on a rather limited axis. And the limitations that sometimes even linger with us to this time, to the present and the now, is that a lot of people think that Islam came with the revelation of the Quran. But I think the Prophet Muhammad was a Muslim before that. The early manifestation was in the form of a reform struggle against slavery, gender equality, social justice, economic equality. Those were all the Islam that the Prophet taught afterwards. The only difference was the divine intervention in the form of the revelation had not come. So Islam was there before Quran. Quran simply endorsed it. So Muhammad was a prophet with a mission to reform society. That mission got a divine connection with the revelation of the Quran. The next stage of religiosity in the Muslim society was primarily in the form of faith as a determined factor, that people were measured by how much they believed in the one God that the Prophet and the Quran preached. Hallaj's hanging brought the other dimension, that yes, we can understand or we can approach the divine through our moral and ethical revolutions and reforms like the Prophet did. Yes, we can understand and approach the divine through the verses of Quran, uttering them with our lips and taking them to our heart and acting upon them through our body. But more so, human and humankind is not a mere flesh and bone. That the essence of our being is not in our physicality. That is for the survival. What we really are the manifestations of God's love to create a mirror for His glory to be reflected. And that is not quantifiable. That's not measurable. And therefore, if we have to approach God not as a surviving human/animal being on the earth, as the creation of God, we have to approach it through the spiritual. And that's where our connection with the divine has other more profound and deeper links. We can understand God through reason, or at least we can make an attempt. One dimension. We can understand God through a psycho-spiritual connection, because the emotions are very much a part of us. And we can understand God through our intuitional. So it's the mind, the heart, and the psyche before the body ever comes into the equation. This had to be understood. We take it for granted. But people at the time of Hallaj did not know this. They had one single connection, and it was probably not DSL. So when it failed to work, they had to condemn people for telling the truth. The result of that shaking was that the spiritual thought had to be theorized and philosophized in ways to be faithful to the essence and yet to make it presentable to the average person on the street. So among many, a great thinker from the West, from Spain, by the name of Abdullah ibn al-Arabi, came, and if you listen to what he said, you will find out that he's not really saying much different than what Hallaj said. But he had the opportunity to explain. So let me read you one of his poems. And let me explain why poetry. Poetry, because the regular medium of communication that we call language sometimes is too straight and too direct. And the divine so ineffable that we cannot really understand it as 1 + 1 = 2. And it only in a poetic language we could say 1 + 1 = 1. And Hallaj was saying just that. The idea was that the school of thought that evolved, that Ibn al-Arabi propagated, is called Wahdatul Wujud, the oneness of being. And in this school of thought, the idea is that because all that exists comes of God, comes from God, no entity from that which is created has the right to claim an identity separate from God. Let me repeat. No entity has the right to claim an identity independent of God, outside of God, or next to God. That's what we call shirk. To simply assume that shirk, or simply put, polytheism, is simply because people think there are 2 gods or 3 gods, that's not playing a numeric game. But it's an understanding that the centrality of all existence is only and only God's, and we dare not make any claim to that. Because if we do, and when we do, we take away from God by establishing and seating our ego in its place. In this polarity between a mindset that is totally God-centered, humanity has to become 0 so that God can remain 100. If in this polarity we gravitate things towards ourselves and partake any percentile of that, then we are not seeing God in His totality. And the egocentric humans that we have become, we do that. In many cases, God is so irrelevant, it probably doesn't constitute 5-6% of a human being's consciousness in today's world. Ibn al-Arabi puts this idea as follows. He is now as he was. Praise be to God, Lord of the universes, before whose oneness there is no before, unless the before is He, and after whose singularity there is no after, unless the after is He. He was, and there was not with Him any before nor after, nor above nor below, nor closeness nor distance, nor how nor where, nor when, nor time nor moment, nor period nor duration, nor manifested existence, nor place. And He is now as He was. Now, it's in this eternity of the divine that things don't change. The only thing that changes is our perception. And we have to train ourselves to accommodate in treating that perception, to vary so we can see the beauty of God in all manifestations, and yet keep it focused on the absolute singularity of God. And the believers in the school of Wahdatul Wujud, or the oneness of being, would say that if any individual claims an identity separate, that is shirk. And so the question comes, if we don't do that, then who are we? And Ibn al-Arabi responds in the following poem. You thought that you were you, but you are not you and never were. If you were you, you would be a lord and the second of two. Stop what you're thinking. Between his being and your being, there's no difference. He is not distinct from you, nor you from him. If out of ignorance you declare that you are other than him, your abstinence is obvious. But your ignorance ceases, then you become yielding, because your union is separation, and your separation union. And your distance is closeness. Through that, you become suitable. Abandon the intellect and understand by the light of unveiling, so that what is of him by way of attribute is not superior to you. Do not associate anything with God, so that you are not debased, because polytheism debases. In this context, what Ibn al-Arabi expresses is the thought that the object of spiritual love is divine beauty, which is an aspect of infinity. Ibn al-Arabi considers love to be the highest station of the soul and subordinates to it every possible human perfection. In the course of time, other schools of thought evolved, and some of them questioned the notion of the oneness of being philosophy. So in contrast, or sorry, not really in contrast, more like a parallel to that thought, another theorized perception was offered in the name of wahdat al-shuhud, the oneness of witnessing in the oneness of the divine. The first one is wahdat al-wujud, the oneness of being itself. And the second school would be wahdat al-shuhud, that is to be in the witness. In other words, people who assume that if you think that you are also divine because the God is within you, then they thought, well, if not that, perhaps we can look at it this way, that we are witness of all that is there. And I think that's not Ibn al-Arabi. The Wahdat al-Shuhud is kind of the parallel alternative school of thought. And the counter-argument comes this way, is that if you are the witness and you consider everything else as divine, who are you? You claimed identity. And so these schools, at the philosophical level, they've always debated. But as I said, they are not necessarily competitive, although the words may sound that way. They're more parallel. And among the many, and of course this is not only, among the many thinkers who follow this line, or who adhere to, or perhaps are not strictly Wahdatul Wujudi type thinkers, is Mawlana Rumi. And he presents the argument a little different. He writes, آن کیست که بیرون درون می نگرد در اهل جنون بسط فسون می نگرد و از دیده نگر که دیده چون می نگرد وان کیست که از دیده برون می نگرد. Who is it outside that looks within? Who looks at the company of the insane with 100 magic spells, and look from within the eye to see how the eye sees? Who is it that looks out from within the eye? In other words, he questions the integrity of this veil of the eye, which objectifies outside and subjectivize the inside, that there is a layer, there is a barrier. And he questions that whether that which is being seen and that by whom the seen is seen may not be separate. That the barrier may not exist except for the logical way of explaining it. Because what he presents also is then that argument regarding love as the highest stage of the soul's perfection that Ibn al-Arabi said. Rumi explains it by saying that I explain myself in love, but am embarrassed by it when in love. In other words, it's not anything to talk about, but to be in it. Eloquence clarifies it all, but love is brighter in silence, unexplained. The beloved is all things, the lover, its shrouding veil. The beloved is radiant life, the lover, lifeless without it. Now, to simplify, if that word applies here at all, in my words is that Ibn al-Arabi has tried to understand the love of God while Rumi loved God, loved the understanding of God. Let me repeat that. Ibn al-Arabi tried to understand the love of God and Rumi loved the understanding of God. In the former, the effort implies the incomprehensibility of the ultimate. That's the ultimate truth. Whereas in the latter, any notion of effort ruins the essence of love. Perhaps this is why it's easy to feel Rumi's love of God and empathize with it, but it's not as easy to understand Ibn al-Arabi's wisdom. Again, to reword it, as we say in Arabic, is that to try to rationalize it, to give a reason, to give an explanation, is not the same as feeling, because the feeling comes from the heart. And as the Quran testifies to the fact that there is a thing called the knowledge of the heart. In the Western mindset, knowledge is attributed and limited only to that which is observed, understood, and detected by the mind. But Islam believes that mind alone is not what we learn by, that the knowledge of the heart, in rather simplistic modern terms, the intuition is equally and perhaps more significantly involved in this understanding. When you look at it that way, we could also go to another interpretation of Rumi. And let me read you a few lines here in the original first. I hope I'm not boring you with the original. صورتگر نقاشم هر لحظه بتی سازم وانگه همه بتها را در پیش تو بگدازم صد نقش برانگیزم با روح درآمیزم چون نقش تو را بینم در آتشش اندازم تو ساقی خماری یا دشمن هوشیاری یا آن که کنی ویران هر خانه که می سازم جان ریخته شد بر تو آمیخته شد با تو چون بوی تو دارد جان جان را هله بنوازم هر خون که ز من روید با خاک تو می گوید با مهر تو هم رنگم با عشق تو هم بازم. در خانه آب و گل بی توست خراب این دل، یا خانه درآ جانا یا خانه بپردازم. I'm a form giver, sculpting idols into shapes every moment. But before you, I melt them all down. I invoke 100 phantoms imbued with your spirit. But when I see your image, I set them all afire. Are you a jug of wine to quench my thirst, or a foe of sober intellect, bringing ruin to every house I build? My soul pours into yours in a blending, as I cherish it, absorbing your fragrance. Every drop of my blood blooms where it falls, perpetually proclaiming the one truth. Without you, I'm immersed in the color of love. This heart of mine is desolate without you. In this dwelling of water and earth, enter this house, O Spirit, or I too shall abandon it in emptiness. I'm a form giver. What does he mean by that? Because we live in the form, not the physical, but the observable is also perceived as form. Therefore, the tendency is that we think in images, and the images already have forms. And once the image is formed, we stick to it. And what Rumi is saying that while my mind, my physiognomy is designed to do that, I know better that whenever that image is formed and I'm about to be attached to it, I throw it in the fire. You are above that. He's also using the allegory. Are you a jug of wine to quench my thirst, or a foe of sober intellect? The intellect here is the competitor in that parallel path, is that we try to rationalize understanding God. What Rumi says that whenever the intellect tries to get in my lane as I'm headed towards the divine, I push it back, considering it my foe, the enemy. I stay in my lane. Think of Sirat al-Mustaqim or the Los Angeles freeway, it doesn't matter, so long as you're going. Because in essence, he says, my soul pours into yours in a blending. Is this Ibn al-Arabi or Rumi? Perhaps both. My soul pours into yours in blending. I cherish it, absorbing your fragrance. That is the divine within he's talking about. And every drop of my blood blooms where it falls. Reference to Hallaj. Perpetually proclaiming the one truth, which Hallaj claimed before Rumi, and Rumi is re-uttering it. I'm immersed in the color of love. This heart of mine is desolate with you in this dwelling of water and earth. Go back to Adam, first creation. Water and earth. But that's not what he's concerned about. He wants the divine glory reflected in his heart. Body is irrelevant. So enter this house, O Spirit, or I too shall abandon it in emptiness. So excited about leaving this body. That's why when it comes to Rumi, the one day that the followers and adherents of Rumi celebrate is the day of his death, which happens to be,
December 17th.
that is,
Saturday.
next Saturday. It's called the day or the night of the ascension of the soul of Rumi in marriage to the divine. We come from him, we go back to him. Understand marriage in that sense. So he was that excited about going back to the divine, leaving this earthly cage of the body. Because to the human spiritual essence, the body is irrelevant. Yeah.
Could you go back over I believe you said that Rumi made a similar statement of Hallaj, and I don't recall such a statement. Could you?
Oh, I just said when Rumi is saying that he makes reference to Hallaj by saying that every drop of my blood blooms where it falls, because the context is already there for people to know what that means. And he says, perpetually proclaiming the one truth with you. So addressing, referring to God Almighty, and making a reference to Hallaj as how he lost his life, that every drop of his blood, and that's why he's making reference to his own, that I cherish it absorbing your fragrance, that every drop of my blood blooms where it falls.
I don't see how that is the same statement, though, because
it may not be the same statement. I'm saying is that it's in the spirit of the same thought, expressed differently because, of course, there were different people. But the emphasis I made earlier that between the two philosophical schools of Sufism is that they are parallel, not competitive, not in opposition, not exclusive, but rather inclusive. And so when one dimension is expressed by one particular poet in his or her own way, that is just one aspect. Remember, the opening line was, God's glory being manifested in 100,000 ways, so we can see them with our 100,000 eyes, which we all have, of course. So let me finish the discussion here, and then I will entertain questions later, if that's okay. Or perhaps we might. So, Rashid.
I was just going to make one comment on that beautiful echo in Rumi of Hallaj, and in fact, I'm sure as you know, throughout the Mesnavi, Rumi actually defends Hallaj against the charge of heresy and endorses Hallaj as a beautiful example of understanding.
Yeah, that's why I started with the idea is that it's not only so obvious and so clear that even someone like me could dare defend Hallaj. It's no problem. The point is that who could defend him when it was necessary? Because at that time, like I said, the mindset was not there. The society had not evolved. Somehow we assumed that with the abundance of knowledge about Islam as a tradition and its various sciences, we are assuming that all of these existed. They didn't. People had to work lifetimes to develop this. The way it's easy for us, and I'm not taking anything away from Rumi's argument, the reason it's easy for us is because people have taken the trouble to create the theosophical framework which we use. Our ancestors had trouble riding horses, and we are driving at speeds of 100 miles per hour when the police officer is not behind us. So the only reason every one of us is capable to drive that fast is because freeways have been created, cars have been developed, and so on and so forth. So use that analogy and impose it on the thought process. What makes, in many ways, the average Muslim a much, much better scholar, a more comprehensive scholar than perhaps the highest level, highest ranking scholar in the pre-Hallajian period. In itself shows us that we have the equipment. It's not that we can fly, but we have been given wings, and it's their wings that we fly with. Whether it's the left wing or the right wing, the Wahdat al-Wujud or Wahdat al-Shuhud, just remember, it's the straight path that matters. Which wing you flap more or less, that might be your preference. Yes, Dean.
I'd like to understand things from a historical perspective. So can you tell us how earlier Hallaj was in comparison to when did he came, what time, and before he got followed by Ibn Arabi and Andalus and Rumi, and when those came about? And then how their school of thought was in regard to follower? I mean, was it like a small school of thought where they some kind of seclusion, or was it big at the time and they had a lot of followers? I mean, I'd like to understand it within the historical perspective of the time. And when was that?
Okay, dates. Hallaj demise came at the year 922 Western calendar. Yes, sorry. The historical context of the personage within the drama we are talking about. Hallaj left us in the year 922. Rumi was born, Ibn al-Arabi passed away in the year 1241, and Rumi left us in the year 1273. So it kind of follows in a sequence, but there is a period. Rumi and Ibn al-Arabi were contemporaries, but between the two of them and Hallaj, there is 200-300 years distance.
Perhaps you might want to mention something about the Baghdad school of Tasawwuf and
the question is regarding the legality, the jurisprudential, and the religious dynamics involved at the time of Hallaj. I think the period that we are talking about, Baghdad was the center of the universe, basically, from the human mindset. And the reason was that because Muslims were so open and receptive to different ideas, many schools evolved in philosophy, in religious theology, in tasawwuf, or mysticism and spiritualism. And for many of these ideas to be synthesized, coordinated, harmonized, or debated, discussed, and refuted, there was really a hub of a high level of intellectual activity. And sometimes it mattered whether the Khalif would endorse one or the other to give them a notoriety, but oftentimes they were left at their own efforts to sort of prove themselves. I think in Tasawwuf the main thing was that you had to understand religion in a way that the Prophet didn't come to humanity to tell us when to pray and how to pray and all that. I mean, not exclusively for that. Of course, that's good, that's wonderful, that's beneficial. But we have to understand that this man who was in the eye of the storm, in every sense of the word you can think about it, socially, politically, But oftentimes people forget that this man who was seeing the whole society churning around him, sometimes plucked himself out of the milieu of the social hubbub, and he would go to a dark cave. What was he doing? That was not a place for campaigning, for fighting against social injustice, or for anything, but rather, as the Quran makes reference to, expanding our vision into the horizons, outer horizons, and to the inner horizons. فَالْآفَاقِ وَالْأَنفُسِ. And so he had time to go to the anfus, to go within. And so the spiritual dimension of Islam was not neglected, but it was not in a center stage in the earlier period. And the reason was that the other traditions that were competing with the Muslim community, for them it was not a priority. So the Muslims of the earlier period had to encounter that reality, the political reality, the social reality, the tribalism, and all the other struggles that they had to encounter. That doesn't mean that the spiritual wasn't there, but like I said, it didn't get the center stage. So later on, perhaps closer to the time of Hallaj, people realized what they had missed. So when the spiritual dimension was expanded upon, that's when this became kind of the in thing for the thinkers. So just like in every other regard, that Muslims were receptive and inclusive, in Sufism and in spiritualism also, they tapped onto Christian traditions, Jewish traditions, Hindu traditions, Zoroastrian traditions, and every other tradition they could find. And the idea of Islam was to, if you find a good thing, use it. As a friend of mine would say, if the shoe fits, wear it. So Muslims were not kind of a disregarding thoughts because they came from somewhere. Like what our society often struggles with now, is that the minute you mention a word like Sharia or jihad, now that he is here, people show sensitivity to the word, not to the idea it contains. I was discussing with some good Jewish friends of mine, and I was saying that for the people of the Jewish faith, the Quran has the language of Yahud, but the society has the language of Jahud. And so he said, what does that mean? I said, well, Jahud is derived from jihad. So you're the first one, but people, of course, don't know. So that is to struggle within. So I think I answered the question and probably a little bit more. And now I'm trying to emphasize the poetic for a reason, and the reason is that it allows for an expression sometimes to become logically incomprehensible, and that's its advantage because it allows us to think outside the box. Yes. Yes.
When was Hallaj and Arabi and Rumi born? You said when they died, but when were they born?
The question is regarding their dates of birth. So I don't bite it. Yeah, but it's not chocolate flavor. So in the Muslim tradition, or perhaps in Middle Eastern tradition, the emphasis is not on when a person was born, rather than when a person died. Because the day you die, your record shows the perfection up to that point of who you really were. So your worth is measured by the totality of your life record. So when you read Islamic history books, after the person's name, only one date is given: the day the person died, not the day the person was born. So Muslims don't celebrate birthdays because I think it's not a good reason to remind our mothers for going through all the pain and agony. No, that's non-Sufi interpretation. But that's not a tradition. So in modern history books, of course, because the Western culture is dominant, they put 2 dates. But the date is only the date of, like in case of Hallaj, he died in the year 922. In the year 922, that Hallaj never existed before. That is a total accumulation of what became Hallaj eventually. I'm sure they all did. The work of Hallaj, there are some scholars and some poets who, the way I think about it is that, the question was about whether Rumi or Ibn al-Arabi studied Hallaj. That sometimes the social context, or rather the linguistic context, is removed. In the Islamic civilization, as you know, Arabic was the dominant language for a long time. But then came a time when it was not the only language, and Muslims developed Al-Hamiado in Spain, what is today called Persian in Afghanistan, and Urdu in the Indian subcontinent, and Swahili in Africa. And these became a secondary medium, sort of like a connection to be able to get in touch with the local people more comfortably. Now, in the case of some scholars, when they were in this transition period, like in the case of Hallaj, his writings were in Arabic. And the Persian language, which would have been his native language, had not evolved. The Persian language evolved in Afghanistan, far, far away from where he lived, which was in Fars. And so later it came to Fars, and then other scholars like Rumi picked up on it. So his writing was in Arabic, but he's admired more by the Persians and non-Arabs. And so therefore the Persians who want to read, they would have to go to Arabic, which they often don't understand with all the beauty. We have other people like Iqbal in India, or politically speaking in Pakistan, who wrote beautiful poetry in Persian, but then both India and Pakistan adopted Hindi and Urdu respectively as their national languages. So while they build great minarets and mausoleums after Iqbal in Pakistan, they can't read what he wrote because that's in the language of another place. And you can also say about Ibn al-Arabi that his writing was not in Al-Hamiado, so people in Spain, where he was from, would not understand it. So in some cases, it's the removal of the social context, linguistic context from underneath that isolates people. So in the case of Hallaj, most of his writings are probably they are not known that well in authentic scholastic terms. The one thing that is undisputably his, because his disciple who wrote it, as he says in the form of dictation, is his tawasin, which are taken from the muqatta'at, or the isolated letters of the Quran. Taha and Yasin are only two surahs in Quran that begin with only 2 letters. And in Hallaj's writing, he takes the 2 of the 2, puts them together, collapses them. He uses the first of the first and the second of the second, so it becomes Ta Sin instead of Taha Yasin. And then, of course, for each of its chapters, he, I think there are about 11 chapters in the Ta Sins. Now I'm pluralizing it in English. Of course, it necessitated the pluralization of it in Arabic, which is then called the Tawasin, the broken internal Arabic plural. So the Tawasins are the most authentic record of his thoughts, and there are several. And probably don't have time to get into it, but yes.
Having been practicing Tasawwuf for so many years, I'm in the last several years, I've been trying to ground my tasawwuf in Quran. So could you, I'm not aware of this, what I'm going to ask. How did Imam al-Ghazali see al-Hallaj's statement of al-Haq?
The question is, sister is trying to ground his tasawwuf in the Quran, and the second part is how did al-Ghazali saw Hallaj. Again, names are deceiving. Which al-Ghazali you are talking about? Yes, there were two brothers by the same name, great scholars both, but no. The one scholar, al-Ghazali, al-Ghazali, still had two sides to him. The first side of him was, or the first period of his life, was a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence, and he had nothing to do with tasawwuf. And of course, then he had his awakening, and then he understood, and that will be the second al-Ghazali. And I don't think most people make that distinction. The same thing goes for Rumi. The Rumi before Shams was a great scholar, but the Rumi after Shams is a great lover of God. We can say the same thing about many of these scholars, because people evolve in their life. And so if you're talking about al-Ghazali, the first al-Ghazali would probably have condemned him. The second al-Ghazali would have sided with him.
Is there anything in his writings where he addresses that?
And I can't give you the reference. I'm just analyzing from what I understand the main generalities. I thought that we could conclude this first session by showing you a diagram, if I can put that on the screen, of how we can speak in the microphone and plug the computer at the same time, of the three ways of understanding the divine. This chart that I have designed, I hope it will kind of help you understand it, because sometimes a graphic presentation of a concept. So here, for instance, the integral path of ascension. The intellectual is the intellect, or the thinking being that we are. The intuitional is the emotional being, and the psychospiritual is the, of course, the psychological being. So we are all that being. These are the dimensions of our non-physical entity. This is too extensive, and in my regular lectures, I devote at least 2 hours to the whole thing. But simply put, they are reflectives of the attributes of the divine, and the manifestations would appear this way. That in the intellectual, the intellect, the aql kull, the total intellect, emanates from the divine, and then at this line would indicate the separation between what in the Western tradition we call the physical and the metaphysical separation, and the Islamic tradition we would call it alam al-ma'na, which is the realm of the essence of meaning and the physical, is that in this case that image is kind of reflected. So when we say humans are created in the image of God, that, by the way, is not a Christian thought, Islamic as well. So that image is recreated here. There's a human version of it. In deep psychological terms, which again, depth psychological terms, you might look at it, the archetypal and the physical copy of the archetypal being. If you don't understand it, it's okay. It is meant to make you thirsty for the future. In the intuitional, again, it's the emphasis here. Here the emphasis is on the intellect. Here the emphasis is on the light, nur illahi. The light of God shines on the human heart and reflects off of it. And in the consequence, it creates the shape of human heart. Of course, that's my creativeness there, but to give you an idea. So we can see God in that way too. Now in the psychospiritual one, the Spirit of God descends to the metaphysical level, and it is sort of encapsulated in the human physicality. And then, because humans live in the temporal level and God is in the permanent level, this temporality has to be curved and we go back to the divine. So in other words, the Spirit of God becomes the soul in the human body. Within the period that the Spirit is the soul, it functions here. It has capabilities that the body enables it, and then it goes back and becomes spirit. So in essence, the spirit and the soul are the transformation in that same connectivity that constitutes a descension from the divine and an ascension to the divine. I hope that helps you get a little more confused for the right reason. And we go to another creation, that of Adam. And this creation, in my humble view, Adam was created 3 times. And we will go to another poetic expression by a master of the Ghazal poetry, who is describing from a spiritual perspective the creation, or rather the creation story. Let me explain what Ghazal means. Literally, it is to talk about the beauty of women. But Arabic has its own beauty as language, that sometimes the words, etymologically speaking, connote a concept totally outside of the main line of the, say, if you take the nouns and the verbs, out of the main line of conjugation. So if you could say تغزل يغزل and all the various forms, there's one. Ghazal comes also from ghazal, the gazelle. And what is unique about this animal is that when it runs, its hooves pairs up in its jumping. So sometimes it's running, which is actually jumping. And that creates parallel. And the parallel is then taken over, allegorically used in poetry. That in the Ghazal poetry, you have 2 hemistiches here and 2 over there and then 2 over there, and you keep going that way. And the limitations are only there because of the number of words you can rhyme together. So they usually run from 9 to 14. Beyond that, it becomes qasida, which is a different form of poetry. The poet par excellence of Ghazal, in my view, but not necessarily in my thing, in the view of the majority of the non-Arabic Muslim world, would be Hafiz Shirazi from modern-day Iran or older-day Fars. And he was a perfectionist to a point where almost every Ghazal went across Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Persia and parts of Arabia, and they would come back with all kinds of notes, and he had to refine it over and over and over. And the refinement is important because in the Arabic or Perso-Arabic, Turkish, Pashto, Urdu, in all of these languages, the norm is that you don't rhyme only at the end. There are levels of internal rhyming, the high and the low pitch. You cannot put one word, even if it rhymes, but if it pitches higher or lower, it's out of place. You will be kicked out of any circle of good poets. And Hafiz was probably obsessively concerned with this notion that the poem had to have its musicality with it. So it's not the rhyme. And the rhymes are, of course, not phonetic rhymes. These are prosaic rhymes. And the prosaic rhymes are different in the sense that they go based on established meters. There are 22 of them, 18 in Arabic and total 22 in Persian. So in the prosaic meters, you don't have the freedom to choose the meter. The meters are already established. So anyways, it's a little too detailed as far as poetry is concerned, but let me read you Hafiz. And this is the story of Adam, spelled both ways, A-D-A-M and A-T-O-M, depending on your perspective. در ازل پرتو حسنت ز تجلی دم زد عشق پیدا شد و آتش به همه عالم زد جلوه گرد رخت دید ملک عشق نداشت عین آتش شد از این غیرت و بر آدم زد عقل می خواست کزان شعله چراغ افروزد برق غیرت بدرخشید و جهان بر هم زد مدعی خواست که آید به تماشاگه راز دست غیب آمد و بر سینه نامحرم زد دیگران قرعه قسمت همه بر عیش زدن دل غم دیده ما بود که هم بر غم زد جان الوا هوس چاه سنقدان تو داشت دست در حلقه آن زلف خم اندر خم زد حافظ آن روز طربنامه عشق تو نوشت که قلم بر سر اسباب دل خرم زد My apologies for not being able to deliver it with the same beauty in English because that's just a virtual impossibility. Eternity's splendor. Your beauty unfurled in eternity's infinite splendor when love's appearance set the heavens afire. The angels didn't have the love to see thy countenance. Out of such indifference, the fire of love burned in Adam's eyes. The intellect attempted to light its wick from that burning flame. A spark flew and set the heavens ablaze. Contending desire approached to witness this mystery in the making. Destiny's invisible hand pushed it away. Others drew their lots for indulgence in pleasure, save my sorrow-stricken heart that fell to the pangs of pain. The celestial soul longed to see thy visage, hence its hand reached to part the waves of your tresses. Hafiz, abandon these worldly pleasures. Hafiz abandoned these worldly pleasures the day he etched your name on the mirror of his heart. The philosophical notion that humanity is created out of the love of God precludes the existence of beauty then. So when he says that your beauty unfurled in eternity's infinite splendor, when the love appeared and set the whole heaven on fire, the fire of love destroys everything that doesn't matter. And then he makes reference to the creation and then the setting where God asked the angels to bow before Adam, and they all do except Iblis. So the angels didn't have the love to see thy countenance. Here the reference is made to Iblis rather. Out of such indifference, the fire of love burned in Adam's eyes. And Rumi, I'll try to explain Hafiz through Rumi here, makes a reference in a similar fashion by saying that the difference between the angel's ability or willingness to bow and Iblis's inability or unwillingness not to bow was that the angels saw Adam as the spirit of God, whereas Iblis saw Adam as an earthling. And so Rumi says, آن که آدم را بدن دید او رمید وان که نور معتمن دید او خمید. And so that difference is that the same entity, but it was the different aspects that they could or could not see. The intellect attempted to light its wick from that burning flame, which was the love of God in Adam. What is the intellect? Reason. Why did Iblis refrain from bowing? Because every why demands a reason. He was trying to rationalize it, give it a reason. I am from fire and he is from earth. So the same way you cannot reach and understand God through reason, the same way God's creation, human, could not have been understood or could not have been justified if you had to reason it, to rationalize it. So a contending desire approached to witness this mystery in the making. Destiny's invisible hand pushed it away. When Iblis realizes what had happened, now he was trying to plead his way back into the equation, and Destiny's hand says, stay off. And that is when Iblis demands, or actually pleads with the divine, that he be given a place in the human heart. And the Almighty says, that's my place. And now, from the human quote-unquote fate perspective, Hafiz says, others drew their lots for indulgence and pleasure, save my sorrow-stricken heart that fell to the pangs of pain. The pain is that of separation, that we accepted the responsibility, that we humans accepted the responsibility of carrying the mission assigned to us by Almighty. That's what he's referring to as that in the love of God, the pleasure might be very little, but the pangs of pain are worth it. When you miss someone in longing, a therapist, a psychologist might very quickly reach the conclusion that, oh, this person is so depressed, because that's all they see. But what they don't see is the cause of that depression, or the seemingly depression, which is the longing. So when you're in love, it doesn't matter whether you are with the beloved or without it. If you're inspired, if that fire burns in your heart, nothing can stop it. And the reference to the creation story, I think, what's his name? Reynold Nicholson also translates the first one a little different from mine, where he says, of this fierce glow that love anew within my breast inspire, the sun is but a spark that flew and set the heavens afire. Now, we are moving a little more towards the east, and now I'm going to Afghanistan, and here is Rahman Baba, the great Pashto poet, who is also admired by people in Pakistan. He is using the analogy of the human spirit the allegory of the river for it. Rahman is his name, the name of God, but he is called Rahman Baba out of respect as the father, Papa. چه هر دم لخپل ځان گریزانیم هم پدا لکه دریاب د درو کانیم مرگی تریخته چه جندون د چا شیرین شی ز خرسند یار تر وصل به هجرانیم نادانی می داناییش و لکه طفل پنا پاک و گوهرک پاک دامانیم چه د نفس د حرس ملک می مسخر کرد په هوا د پاسه تخت د سلیمان یم تن می څه کړی چې زړه یار راڅخه یووړ بېهوده د خالي خونې نګهبان یم لکه ګل چې په نار مات کړی اویزان وي زه هم هسې د ژوندو د مړو تر میان یم کله ځان راته ولي کله عاصي شي نه خبر خپل کمال نه په نقصان یم خپل جانان مې هسې نقش دی په زړه کې نه پوهېږم چې رحمان یم که جانان یم. In the suspense of contrasts. Like a river, from myself I flow and run. What a treasure trove of pearls have I become. Death is harsh. When life is only joy and thrill, I rejoice more in the longing than in union that I referred to earlier. Like a child, all my ignorance seems wisdom. I avoid this worldly decadence of ruin. I have conquered ego's greed and its desires. I am Solomon on winged celestial throne. Oh, the vanity of form, the joy of love. In this solitude I guard heart's empty chamber. Between life and death suspended by a thread, dangling flower from a stem, my broken heart. Now I see myself a saint and now a sinner, now bewildered by the gain, I'm at loss. This etched image on my heart is the beloved. I am lost now from the self. I am the self.
Is he contemporary also of
15th century. He's the contemporary of Hafiz. So now we are moving roughly another 200 years. So we have Hafiz, and then we have Rahman Baba, and then we have Bedil in India. So we will be now moving on to the next one. Rahman Baba was a Sufi of the Chishtiya order, and he started writing in Pashto. In those earlier periods, tradition was that if you had to write, you had to write in Farsi, in Persian. And so he broke with the tradition, but the good thing is that he didn't disappoint people. He wrote so beautifully that he is considered the Hafiz of the Pashtuns. Yes?
Could you give us a really brief context of what it means to be part of a Sufi order and the different major Sufi orders? I don't mean like a whole history, but just in a nutshell, what does that mean? Really briefly.
I think I stated earlier that once, right after the death of Hallaj, it was understood that many paths could lead to God, or in these many paths is not just the traditions of Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, not in that sense, but even within the same one. So you could follow a different path. And as far as Sufism is concerned, the idea here is that you go through a self-purification process, a psychotherapeutical and psychospiritual combination of is there something called the 12 steps? So the Sufis have their 7 steps, and in these 7 steps you understand the love of God, feel it within you. You have to have the desire, and you have to have a stage of contentment with the worldly matters. In other words, to distance yourself from it or de-emphasize them. And then you reach the level of hayra, which is a bewilderment in the imaginal perspective, if you can understand or have a revelation, not the word revelation, but the revelation in the image form, theophanies. And then you move on to a level where you become nothing, your nothingness, your self-annihilation. And when you annihilate within, you're reborn with the divine. And so then you reach the tawheed, or the oneness. So you become one with God. Remember, Ibn al-Arabi was telling us earlier, if you claim to be, you're one of the two. And that, of course, he dismissed then. So the Sufis have, there is a theoretical Sufism, people who basically theorize and philosophize and write about it. There is also practical Sufism. Generally, the theoretical is called irfan, understanding or reacquaintance with the divine, and the practical is generally called Sufism, or self-purification. The two usually go parallel, but depending on the individual you talk about, some are more into the practical, others are more into the theoretical, and some are into more poetical. Some are into the body movements and music, others are into dancing and whirling, and there are many, many ways that when we are talking about the Sirat al-Mustaqim, the way to God, we are talking about it in pluralities that lead to the singularity. And the orders are usually established to kind of educate and train novices, younger people. And there are probably at least 40 orders around the world, from Indonesia and Malaysia to Morocco and Spain and everywhere in between. And many of them incorporate traditions or practices from their local traditions into this. So I think that's basically what it is. So it's the practical Sufism is the one of the orders, the tariqah. So if you talk to a Sufi and they say they have a tariqah, then they are doing the practical. If you're talking to a Sufi who says arif or irfan, the gnosis, then they are more into the theoretical. Let's see, Bedil is, he was born in India, of a Turkish descent. He was an officer in the Mughal army. And when you look at the collection of his poetry, the one I have is 3 thick volumes of about 3 inches wide. And you wonder, when did this officer had time? But more so, the way Hafiz stands in the realm of let's say South Asia, Central Asia, and Persia, there are 3 schools of now we're getting to that poetic classification of how to write poetry. Now that doesn't have to do with the prosody, but rather with the style of expression. There is the Hindi style, which is from India, which we will see an example. Hafiz is the Iraqi style, and then there's the Khurasani style, which will be central and northern Afghanistan. In the Hindi style, the more complex the poem, the better it is. The poet takes you on one line, one verse. And the moment you try to grasp the idea of the allegory, he twists it on you right there. You haven't even enjoyed the first one. And then he twists it again and again and again. And so it could be very confusing if you're not used to, like, where is he headed with this? But in these twists, what he does is that he or she, that one, it tries to, remember we talked about the internal rhyming, to perfect that. And in that perfection, then on top of it comes that the idea is also given a turn. It's not the language, the wording. And so Badal is very difficult to understand by most people, because you have to read every verse several times over and over and it's like, wait a minute, where are we going with this? So let me read just a part of this in the original, then we'll go to the translation. با اقبال حضورت صد گلستان عیش در چنگم مشو غایب که چون آیینه از رخ می پرد رنگم شدم پیر و نیم محرم نوای ناله درده برنگ سایه از خود غافلم لیک محبت کاش بنوازد فیل پیکر چنگم برنگ سایه از خود غافلم لیک این قدر دانم که گر پنهان شوم نورم و گر پیدا همین رنگم In the glory of thy presence I embrace the joy of 100 gardens. I beg of thee not to fade, as I will vanish without you like a reflection in a mirror. I have lived a life, but I have yet to resonate in the painful yearnings of intimacy. Would that love harp on the frailty of my bent body's fragile frame? Does it come across there? So he is he's getting at an older age, like me, and he is using his bent body to be a harp. But he says that the right music was never played on this. So I want to hear what? The resonance of the string, which is him. But it has to be played by love. So love is the musician, the divine. Like a shadow, unaware of my existence, I know not, but this I know, that I am a light in my concealment and am manifested as the color of being when revealed. My tearless eyes depart the providence of your presence, consoling this bleeding heart bent on resisting to weep in your longing. What would be a great challenge. My heart's chamber takes the shade of dark collyrium as I burn a smoldering candle, breathless fire of separation. I pawned modesty of manners for a scandalous ill repute. Like a rosebud, all my secrets are at the whim of a gentle breeze. From the matchless beauty of Layla, I earned insanity's delight. I am pelted with stones, her reminiscence yet to bloom. This would be one of those untranslatable. He plays on the word junoon, majnoon, and then he plays on Layla, the darkness, that in the darkness he goes crazy. And then he is being stoned because anyone who is crazy, the absence of civil rights that people didn't enjoy in those times, they would be pelting the insane ones with stones. So he becomes the Majnun for the Layla. I asked the harp to unveil the secret of its octaves. A responding echo said, there is no harmony in the resonance of your strings. So again, he's using the word parda, which would mean not only an octave, but also a veil, which keeps the secret on the other side. But when you play the music that is hidden comes back to the surface, and the surface is the audible surface. So he says, I asked the harp, and he uses the word qanun. Qanun both means order and law, but it's also the name of an instrument. So you don't know which level is he talking about. So at one level he said, I asked law and order, as opposed to chaos, to tell me what is the secret of the divine so I would know. On the other hand, he said, I asked the harp, the instrument, to unveil, to release the resonance of the music. And what was the answer? A responding echo said, there is no harmony in the resonance of your string. Which is, like, again, it could be interpreted in both ways. I'm longing for the day when the contented soul esteemed chisels me out of the dark shadows of this colorless underworld. That is denying it every notion of a poetic thought. So in a simply straightforward language, it would sound like that, where the thought could enjoy it, but the emotions might lag behind. A whisper conveys to my ego's fogging mirror that I'm the king of a free domain, and this, the seat of my throne. Remember, God-centered, human-centered concept. In losing myself, my roughness doesn't shape my expectation. Like a peacock feather, I dial a colored cycle of illusion. Can't find myself. What is it, the ego or the self? So what do? Look around. That search, the futility of it is like the feather of the peacock. And he's also looking at it more in terms of dialing it out. And what? Not being able to find it. Would my feeble efforts reach the beloved destination as I gasp for a short breath with a limping, blistered heart? So he is trying to reach God through his heart. If it was his body, it would be the blistered feet. But he's limping with the heart. Remember the Buddhists of Tibet who prostrate every step of the way. And there were Sufis and mystics in Islam who did the same thing for Hajj. Bedil's name spreads through the prism of worldly fame, lest the feathers of his flight remained restrained, hitched to a stone. The poets usually had what is called a signature line. In the last verse, they use their poem to sort of use a modern terminology to copyright it. And then oftentimes from the praise of God, it was self-praise. Like Hafiz said in the earlier poem, that it is his pen that is combing the tresses of the divine, and from it getting the meaning. So the divine is allegorically compared to a beautiful woman, or maybe a man with long hair, and that the pen becomes the comb. So the comb straightens the hair, but the pen tries to get the meaning out of it, which becomes then the fragrance he was talking about in the subsequent line. I'm making reference to an early one. I just love Bedil so much that I just go crazy with with his thoughts. Sometimes I take them out of just nowhere. Here is just one verse from one of his other poems where my wondering comes like, how was this thought within him trying to create itself, basically? That the layers of allegories are sometimes so deep, sometimes linguistic, sometimes form, shape, color. So here is a short one, and in the original, بساز نیستی بسته است شور ما و من بارش بهارت بلبلی دارد که شکل لاست منقارش. Maybe this is worth connecting. He is making an allegory on the word law, which is this one. You can all see it, right? Okay. Saz is the music, nesti is the nothingness, because of what the material world is worth. Shor is the excitement. And then he says, I'm on top of it. I'll read you the translation. But perhaps I should read you the translation to make a little more sense out of this. Okay, I ride the wave of excitement and joy. That is, I don't know what happened here. Technology has to do its thing, once in a while, so just not to be forgotten that we are dependent. So, I ride the wave of excitement and joy that is rooted in the melody of nothingness. No wonder that the herald of your vernal spring is sounded through the nay-shaped beak of the nightingale. The shape of the beak is like law, and law in Arabic means no. When you do the declaration of faith, la illah, so he's saying, remember, when we confessed and accepted, the first thing we accept was nothingness. We have to clear the slate. There is no God. And in Arabic, of course, all you have to say is that law is the equivalent of there is, the whole text of that. So he says that the nightingale that sings in this vernal garden of yours sings through a beak that has the shape of negating everything. So why should we attach more meaning to it? Now we go to Iqbal, who is, in my opinion, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century in the Muslim world. And he writes that در بود و نبود من اندیشه گمان ها داشت از هیچ هویدا گشت الحق که هستم من. No, that's Farsi. Yeah. My sense of wonder was lost in the quest of my being and non-being existence. It became evident from nothingness that indeed I am. Nothingness. So, if you promise to not ask difficult and unanswerable questions, let me entertain a few. Yes?
One question about Baydil.
Mm-hmm.
Baydil, is that his real name or is that a nickname? Because Baydil does not mean heartless, without
Right.
heart.
Mm-hmm. Question is asked about Baydil. His real name is Mirza Abdul Qadir Baydil Dehlawi Abul Ma'ani. The last one, Abul Ma'ani, he's the father of meaning. A very, very high honorific that the poets have given him that title. So in Afghanistan, you simply say Abul Maani. Bedl means the one without the heart, yes, but more in contextualizing it in the stream of his poetic thought, that is the longing, that continuously longing. So when one falls in love, in the Western culture, you fall in love. The falling is important perhaps because of the insurance coverage, which never includes that. The breaking of the heart, the falling of the heart, it's very fragile thinking. But in the Islamic culture, at least with the traditions that I'm familiar with, it's the giving of the heart to the other. In other words, losing your heart in the beauty of the beloved. So once you lose it, you have given it so you don't have it. So Bedl is the one without the heart. He's the lover, yeah. Oh, you're just writing it down? Okay, so that question was to the computer. Okay. Yes?
Could you go over the three schools of poetry? I think you were talking about the three schools of poetry.
That is basically within the realm of the Persianate world. Hindi, which is from India, Indian school. Khurasani, which is from Afghanistan, Khurasan, and Iraqi, which is from like Iraq. But we are not talking about political boundaries here, rather the boundaries of the literary traditions that were popular at the time. You still have a question, or you're just showing off your pen? Yes?
Just back again to the, put these in the realm of the historical perspective at the time. Like you did mention at the beginning about Hallaj and how he was prosecuted and all that. But what about the others? Because as you mentioned, that the school of thinking and philosophical work, the Muslims at the time were more open to all of that, and they were acceptance of so many different ideas. So was at that time these kind of thinking were flourishing, and how it had moved through the history and to the 20th century?
The question harkens back to Hallaj. Well, this is what the crisis, the tragedy did to the Muslim culture. People didn't think that they would sign the order of his death, because he was telling the truth, even if everyone didn't understand him. Now, but when it happened, people were very uneasy. So instead of speaking bluntly, as they were, as philosophers usually do, they tried to camouflage their thought in poetic parlance. When the allegory of the divine is made with the beloved, and the beloved for men would look like a woman and vice versa, perhaps there were exceptions to that, then the idea was that if anyone really got in trouble, they would simply say, look, what's wrong? I'm expressing my love to my beloved. And of course, love is secret. That's why the rose. And so it gave the poets a lot of, the Sufis a lot of protection to express themselves in poetic terms. And so then it became more of a tradition that if anyone was anybody in those days, you had to not just write, of course, which was a given, but you had to write in poetry. And the poetry helped them in several ways. One, they could hide their intentions when in trouble. Two, they could, in a way, protect their work from plagiarism, because it's difficult to rhyme. And then sometimes when people, in spite of that effort, tried to plagiarize poetry, oftentimes it was easy to figure out, like you go through this whole thought, and then all of a sudden there is a little bit of deviation. Somebody is, poetry. He hated poetry all his life until he fell in love, and then he didn't know how to stop it. But there were, of course, the Quranic reference to the poets is that the inspiration we get from God doesn't have to be only in the form of wahya, which is a revelation to a prophet. You don't have to be only a prophet to have that privilege. God inspires us in many ways. And in one of the ways that is more poetic and Quran is not poetry, that the social context was made reference to. But otherwise, I think poetry is the best way to talk about not just love, because love is indescribable, undefinable, and oftentimes ununderstandable when it is in reference to a human being. But when it's the love of God, where not only is the process difficult to understand, it's the entity, quote unquote, only thing that matters is the one, the true beloved. And of course, in Islamic context, kind of the motive for the whole dynamics to express